There's a moment in every man's life when the world tells him exactly who he is supposed to be. It whispers through the voices of those around him. It echoes in the choices they expect him to make. And for most men, that's where the story ends. They listen, they conform, they fade into the shadow of what others believe. But every once in a blue moon, a man comes along who refuses to hear what the world is saying. His name was Jacob Hartwell. He wasn't a revolutionary. He wasn't a philosopher or a politician. He was a cowboy, a simple, weathered man with calloused hands and a quiet determination that would soon shake the very foundations of a territory that had stood rigid in its traditions for 100 years. This is the story of how one man's refusal to accept ridicule led him to master something the entire frontier society said was impossible. And in doing so, he didn't just change his own life. He changed an entire way of thinking. It all began with a prophecy, a challenge, a promise so bold that most men would have laughed it off and forgotten it by sundown. But Jacob Hartwell wasn't most men. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind swept across the Silver Pine Basin like a voice that had been waiting to speak for centuries. It carried the scent of sage and dust, rolling across endless plateaus where grass grew sparse and the horizon seemed to stretch into infinity. Here, in this unforgiving landscape, stood the small township of Copper Ridge, a place where traditions were carved into stone, and change was treated like a plague to be avoided at all costs. Jacob Hartwell had arrived 3 years ago, and in those 3 years he had become the township's favorite subject of quiet contempt. He was a drifter by trade, a man who had worked cattle drives from Montana to Texas, who had lived in wagon camps and bunkhouses, and who carried his entire world in a single worn leather bag. When he first rode into Copper Ridge, he was looking for nothing more than steady work and a place to lay his head without judgment. What he found instead was a community so entrenched in its ways that any deviation from the norm was treated like heresy. Jacob was different in ways that didn't sit well with the established order. He didn't drink whiskey like the other ranch hands. Instead, he spent his evenings studying old maps and learning about territorial geology from a book he'd acquired years ago. He didn't gamble or spend his wages in the saloon. He saved meticulously, worked harder than most men twice his age, and maintained a quiet distance from the gossip that seemed to fuel the social structure of Copper Ridge. Most peculiarly, he spent hours each week at the territorial office, asking questions about land management, irrigation systems, and the historical patterns of the Blackstone Creek, a river that had never been properly mapped by the settlers, though it ran through some of the most contested territory in the region. The townspeople noticed. They noticed, and they judged. "That Hartwell's too quiet for his own good," old Pete Richardson would say, nursing his beer at the Golden Nugget Saloon. "Man that keeps to himself like that ain't natural, probably up to something. Heard he's been sniffing around the tribal council," another voice would add with a sneer. "Spending time up at the reservation talking to those Indians. What kind of white man does that?" The tribal council. There was the real source of the town's disdain for Jacob. The Blackstone tribe, led by Chief Running Bear, a man of 73 winters, whose face was weathered like ancient leather, and whose eyes held the wisdom of 1,000 seasons, occupied the land directly north of Copper Ridge. For decades, there had been tension between the settlers and the tribe. The territory was rich with potential. Water access was abundant in certain areas. Game was plentiful. But the land was also disputed, contested, and the subject of countless arguments about rights, ownership, and who had the legitimate claim to develop it. The township's leaders, men like Mayor Clarence Dalton and the county commissioner Robert Ashford, had always treated the tribal lands as a problem to be solved, a complication to be managed. The tribal council was seen as stubborn, unreasonable, and resistant to progress. This was the official narrative, and it was believed without question. Jacob, however, had begun asking different questions. 3 months after arriving in Copper Ridge, he'd made an unexpected journey north to the reservation. He'd ridden alone, unarmed, bearing no weapons and no hostile intentions. He simply wanted to listen. He wanted to understand the tribe's perspective on the disputed territories. He wanted to learn about their knowledge of the land, their understanding of water systems, and their vision for coexistence rather than conflict. What he found shocked him. Chief Running Bear was not the unreasonable antagonist that the townspeople had painted him to be. He was a thoughtful man, deeply concerned with the welfare of his people and genuinely open to dialogue. The tribal elders possessed centuries of accumulated knowledge about managing the land sustainably. They understood water flow patterns that the settlers had never even considered. They knew which areas were prone to drought, which could support large-scale agriculture, and which should remain untouched for the land's health and the tribe's spiritual practices. Most importantly, Chief Running Bear had articulated something that made Jacob's perspective shift entirely. The greatest territory, the chief had told him, his voice carrying the weight of generations, is not the one that a man claims by force or by law. It is the one that a man understands so completely that he can steward it with wisdom. Should you master it, truly master it, the integration of our knowledge and yours, the combining of tribal understanding with settler innovation, the greatest territory awaits, a place of abundance that could serve both our peoples. It was a challenge, it was a prophecy, it was an invitation, but it was also something that would make Jacob a pariah in Copper Ridge. When word got back to town that Jacob had spent an entire day at the tribal council listening to Chief Running Bear speak, the reaction was swift and severe. He became the subject of ridicule that cut deeper than simple mockery. It was the kind of scorn that questioned not just his judgment, but his loyalty, his character, and his very belonging in white society. "He's gone native," they said. "Lost his mind out there in the sun. Probably been talking to those Indians about how to betray the town," another voice speculated. Mayor Dalton summoned him to the town office one afternoon. The meeting was brief, but brutal. "Mr. Hartwell," the mayor had said, his tone icy and official, "I think it's time you understood the nature of loyalty. This town has given you work. We've given you a place to stay. And you repay that by consorting with the very people who stand in the way of our progress." Jacob had stood quietly, listening without defending himself. He knew that any explanation would fall on ears that had already made their judgments. "I'm not telling you to leave," the mayor had continued, "but I am telling you that you are no longer welcome at the town gatherings. You will not be invited to the social events. The respectable people of this town will not associate with you. You're on your own now, Mr. Hartwell. I suggest you remember which side you belong to." That had been 6 weeks ago. Since then, Jacob had become increasingly isolated. The ranch where he worked, the Broken Arrow, owned by a man named Thomas Brennan, became the subject of scrutiny. Other business owners began to question whether they should continue trading with Brennan if he was harboring someone so sympathetic to the tribal cause. Slowly, deliberately, the town was squeezing him out, using social pressure and economic leverage as weapons. Jacob responded by doing what he had always done. He worked, he studied, he continued his solitary journeys to the tribal lands, seeking knowledge and understanding. But now, there was something else burning inside him. A purpose, a determination that had been ignited by Chief Running Bear's words. He began to spend every spare moment mapping the Blackstone Creek's path through the disputed territory. He studied water management systems used by other settlements. He learned about soil composition, seasonal rainfall patterns, and agricultural potential. He spent hours in conversation with tribal elders, absorbing their knowledge of sustainable land management. He consulted with Mexican ranchers who had different approaches to ranching and land stewardship. He read everything he could find about irrigation, engineering, and territorial development. The townspeople watched this with a mixture of confusion and contempt. They didn't understand what he was doing. They didn't see the vision forming in his mind, a comprehensive plan that could prove Chief Running Bear's prophecy true. A way to develop the disputed territory that would benefit both the settlers and the tribe, creating abundance rather than scarcity, cooperation rather than conflict. To them, he was simply a fool, wasting his time on an impossible dream. Jacob lived in a small cabin on the edge of town, a place that had become his refuge and his isolation. The walls were covered with maps and notes. His table was perpetually cluttered with papers, sketches, and calculations. His evenings were spent by candlelight, working late into the night, refining his vision, testing his theories, and building the foundation of something that most people believed could never exist. The irony was not lost on him. In trying to master something that would bring his people and the tribe together, he had been cast out by his own people. The very thing that he believed would prove his worth had become the instrument of his ridicule. But Jacob Hartwell had learned something important in his years of solitude. Ridicule only has power if you allow it to define you. And he had decided, somewhere deep in his heart, that the opinion of a closed-minded town would not dictate the trajectory of his life. The question was simple: could he actually do it? Could he master the knowledge required to develop the territory in a way that honored both cultures and proved that the greatest achievements come not from conquest, but from understanding? The answer would require him to become something he had never been before. It would require him to bridge two worlds that seemed irreconcilably divided. It would require him to face not just ridicule, but genuine hatred from people who felt threatened by and what he represented. And it would all begin with a single moment, a moment when someone unexpected would believe in him, when someone from the community would see past the ridicule and recognize the vision he was pursuing. That moment was coming, and when it arrived, everything would change. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The morning Jacob received the summons from Thomas Brennan, the Broken Arrow's owner, he knew something had shifted. Brennan was a pragmatist, a businessman first and foremost, and he had always maintained a careful distance from the town's social politics. But even pragmatists had limits, and Jacob suspected he was about to discover where Brennan's line had been drawn. The ranch house was a sprawling structure of weathered wood and stone, perched on a rise that overlooked the eastern pastures. Jacob had worked for Brennan for nearly 2 years, and in that time he'd earned a reputation as one of the most reliable and hard-working hands the ranch employed. But lately, he knew that Brennan's other business associates had been applying pressure, suggesting that keeping Jacob on the payroll was becoming a liability. Thomas Brennan was a tall man with silver threading through his dark hair, his face lined by decades of sun and hard decisions. He sat behind a heavy oak desk when Jacob entered, and there was something in his expression that suggested this conversation would not be easy for either of them. "Jacob," Brennan began, his tone measured and careful, "I need to talk to you about your future here at the Broken Arrow." Jacob felt the words coming before Brennan spoke them. His employment was ending. The pressure from the town had finally won out. He nodded slowly, preparing himself for dismissal. "The truth is," Brennan continued, leaning back in his chair, "the business community in Copper Ridge has made it clear that my association with you is affecting my standing. The bank is questioning my creditworthiness. Suppliers are raising their prices. Other ranchers are suggesting they might find alternative sources for the services I provide. It's not personal, Jacob. It's business. And I can't afford to let it destroy everything I've built." Jacob understood. He'd expected this for weeks. The only question was, what would come next? Whether Brennan would simply let him go with a final paycheck, or whether there was something more to this conversation. "I understand, sir," Jacob said quietly. "I'll pack my things and be gone by sundown." Brennan held up a hand. "Let me finish." He stood and walked to the window, looking out over the ranch lands that stretched toward the horizon. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he turned back to face Jacob. "I have a daughter," Brennan said. "Her name is Eleanor. She's 26 years old, educated, intelligent, and she's been asking questions about things that most young women in this territory wouldn't dare to ask. About progress, about why we do things the way we do them, about whether there might be better ways to approach problems." Jacob wasn't sure where this was going, but he listened intently. "Eleanor has been watching you," Brennan continued. "She's seen how you work, how you think. She's even read some of the notes you've left at the ranch, sketches and calculations you've left behind. She came to me 3 days ago and asked me something that I've been turning over in my mind ever since." Brennan returned to his desk and picked up a piece of parchment. On it was a sketch, one of Jacob's sketches. It showed a detailed map of the Blackstone Creek's path, with annotations about water flow and irrigation potential. "She asked me," Brennan said, "why a man as intelligent and diligent as you would waste his talents working cattle when he clearly has a vision for something greater. She asked me if you were working on something important, and when I said I didn't know, she suggested that perhaps someone should ask." Jacob felt something shift inside him, a moment of unexpected recognition from someone he'd never met. "I don't know what your project is," Brennan continued, "but Eleanor sees something in you that the rest of this town refuses to acknowledge. And that's the reason I asked you to come here today. Not to fire you, Jacob, but to offer you something different." Brennan walked to a shelf and retrieved a leather folder. Inside were documents, property deeds, and a map of significant size. "I own land," Brennan explained. 75 acres on the western edge of the disputed territory. It's been sitting idle for years because I couldn't develop it without getting tangled up in the territorial disputes. I bought it as a speculation years ago, thinking that eventually the disputes would be resolved and the land would become valuable. But nothing has changed. The tension between the settlers and the tribe remains exactly as it was. He spread the map across his desk, and Jacob could see the red boundary lines indicating Brennan's holdings. "Here's what I'm proposing," Brennan said. "Effective immediately, you are no longer an employee of the Broken Arrow. Instead, you become a consultant. I'm offering you room and board in the bunkhouse, a monthly stipend of $40 more than you make as a ranch hand, and complete access to my 75 acres of land. I'm also giving you access to my contacts, my resources, and my credibility in the business community." Jacob's mind raced. "Why would you do this? The town will turn on you even more intensely." "They already have," Brennan said with a thin smile. "Might as well give them a real reason." Besides, Eleanor made a compelling argument. She said that sometimes a man has to choose between the safety of conformity and the possibility of something remarkable. She said that we live in a territory that's stuck in the past, refusing to evolve, and that we'll be left behind by history if we don't take risks. "What does Eleanor want in return?" Jacob asked, sensing there was more to this offer than simple charity. "She wants access to the project," Brennan said. "Whatever you're building, whatever vision you're pursuing, she wants to be part of it. She wants to learn. She's tired of being treated like a decorative object in a man's world. She wants to contribute to something meaningful." It was an unusual arrangement. In Copper Ridge, women simply didn't involve themselves in territorial development or business ventures. But Eleanor Brennan, it seemed, was not a conventional woman. "How will she be involved?" Jacob asked carefully. "However you see fit," Brennan replied. "But she's intelligent, Jacob. She's read books on engineering. She knows mathematics. She speaks Spanish from a tutor we hired years ago. She's also talked to the wives of some of the business community, and she understands the social dynamics of this territory better than most men do. She could be useful, or she could just observe and learn. That's your decision." Jacob felt the weight of this moment. This was the turning point. Chief Running Bear's words echoed in his mind. Should you master it, the greatest territory awaits. But mastery required resources, credibility, and most importantly, it required someone to believe in him. Thomas Brennan was offering him a foothold, a way to move forward without being completely crushed by the town's contempt. And his daughter, Eleanor, was offering something even more valuable: recognition, intellectual partnership, and a perspective he hadn't considered. "There's one condition," Brennan added. "You have 6 months. In 6 months, I need to see evidence that your vision is viable. I need to see calculations, plans, proof that this isn't just a dream. Because if you can't deliver that, the financial community will start asking questions about where I'm investing my money, and I won't be able to justify continuing this arrangement." Jacob nodded. 6 months. It was both generous and compressed. It was a real deadline, a real pressure to produce results. "And there's one more thing," Brennan said quietly. "Eleanor will want to meet with you. She'll likely come to the bunkhouse within the next day or two. She'll have questions. She'll probably challenge your assumptions. She's going to be difficult, Jacob. But she's also going to make you sharper. She won't accept platitudes or vague theories. She'll demand specifics." "I understand," Jacob said. "Good, because this arrangement will make you a target," Brennan continued. "The town will see this as me conspiring with you. Eleanor's involvement will scandalize people. They'll say things. They'll question my judgment and her virtue. But Eleanor decided that this was worth the cost. She's chosen to align herself with your vision, whatever it is. Now you need to prove to both of us that her faith isn't misplaced." Brennan extended his hand across the desk. It was a gesture of alliance, of partnership, of belief in something uncertain and unconventional. Jacob shook it firmly. "One last thing," Brennan said as Jacob was leaving. "Eleanor asked me to tell you something. She said, 'Tell Mr. Hartwell that ridicule is just proof that he's doing something that matters. People only ridicule what frightens them, and Copper Ridge is frightened of change.'" Jacob left the ranch house that afternoon with his worldview fundamentally altered. He had been isolated, dismissed, and targeted by the community. But now, suddenly, he had resources. He had credibility through Brennan's backing. Most importantly, he had an ally, someone inside the community, who believed in his vision enough to risk her own standing. That evening, Jacob sat in the bunkhouse and looked at the maps and calculations that covered every surface. The work suddenly felt different. It wasn't the desperate hobby of a lonely outsider anymore. It was the foundation of something that other people believed in. He pulled out a fresh piece of parchment and began to organize his thoughts in a way that would make sense to someone like Eleanor Brennan, someone who would ask difficult questions and demand rigorous answers. The catalyst had arrived. The story was no longer about Jacob's isolation. It was about to become something far more complex and consequential. Everything was about to change. Eleanor Brennan arrived at the bunkhouse on a Wednesday morning, riding a chestnut mare with the kind of confidence that suggested she'd spent her entire life on horseback. Jacob was outside, working on a series of calculations he'd laid out on a makeshift table constructed from old lumber and sawhorses. He was so focused on the measurements that he didn't notice her approach until her shadow fell across his work. "These measurements are inconsistent," she said without preamble, dismounting from her horse with practiced ease. Jacob looked up, startled. He'd been expecting Eleanor Brennan eventually, but he hadn't expected her to appear so suddenly or to immediately begin critiquing his work. "They're preliminary," he said, straightening. "I'm still gathering data." "That's not an excuse for imprecision," she replied, tying her horse to a post. She was a tall woman, dressed in practical riding clothes rather than the elaborate fashions worn by most ladies in Copper Ridge. Her hair was bound back in a simple braid, and her eyes were sharp, intelligent, and entirely unimpressed by his defensive tone. Eleanor Brennan was nothing like the women Jacob had encountered in frontier towns. There was no artifice about her, no attempt to appear delicate or dependent. She moved with purpose and spoke with the directness of someone who had learned that subtlety was often wasted in a territory where most people weren't listening anyway. "You're assuming a water flow rate based on observation alone," she continued. studying his sketches without asking permission. But you haven't accounted for seasonal variation. Have you tracked the creek's volume through different times of year? I've only been in the territory for 3 years, Jacob replied. I don't have a full seasonal cycle of data. Then why are you making calculations that require it? She asked, turning to face him directly. This is precisely the kind of fuzzy thinking that gets men killed on the frontier. Assumptions that seem reasonable lead to irrigation systems that fail. Failed systems lead to starvation. Starvation leads to conflict. Jacob felt a flash of irritation. He'd spent months developing these calculations, working late into the night, trying to make sense of incomplete information. And this woman, whom he'd just met, was dismissing his work out of hand. If you have criticism, he said coolly, I'm open to hearing it. But standing here telling me what I've done wrong without offering solutions isn't particularly helpful. Eleanor smiled, a quick, genuine expression that transformed her face. Fair point. My father warned me that I have a tendency to lead with condemnation rather than collaboration. Old habits from arguing with my father in his study when I was 16. She extended her hand. I'm Eleanor Brennan. I assume you're Jacob Hartwell. My father told me you're working on a territorial development plan that involves bridging the interests of the settlers and the tribe. Jacob shook her hand, noting the firm grip and the calluses on her fingers. This was not a woman who spent her days needle-pointing in a parlor. Your father also mentioned that you'd want to be involved, Jacob said, though I'm not entirely clear on how that would work, given the social constraints of the territory. My father also mentioned that I don't particularly care about social constraints, Eleanor countered. And before you ask whether I'm serious, yes, I am. I've spent my entire life watching this. Territory remains static while the world around us evolves. I've watched bright people make decisions based on fear rather than evidence. I've watched talent and potential get wasted because of ideology and prejudice. She walked around the makeshift table, studying Jacob's work from different angles. Tell me about your project. Start from the beginning. Don't leave anything out. So Jacob did. He spent the next 3 hours explaining everything he'd learned about the Blackstone Creek's potential, the tribal knowledge about sustainable land management, the irrigation systems he'd studied, the agricultural possibilities, and the economic models he'd been developing. He showed her his maps, his calculations, his observations about soil composition and rainfall patterns. Eleanor listened without interrupting, asking occasional clarifying questions, but mostly letting him speak. There was something refreshing about explaining his vision to someone who actually understood the technical and strategic components. The townspeople of Copper Ridge either dismissed his ideas outright or simply nodded without comprehension. Eleanor engaged with the concepts themselves, challenging assumptions and asking for evidence. When Jacob finally finished, Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "This could work, but you're missing a critical component." "What?" Jacob asked, knowing she would have identified something he hadn't considered. "Social feasibility," she said. "You have the technical plan worked out more or less, but you don't have a strategy for convincing people on either side to accept it. The settlers will resist because it involves collaboration with the tribe. The tribal council will be cautious because they've been betrayed by settlers before. You need a narrative. A story that makes people on both sides understand what they'll gain by cooperating." "That's not my strength," Jacob admitted. "I understand systems and logistics. Social strategy is different." "It's not as different as you think," Eleanor said. "It's just a system, but the variables are human instead of hydraulic. Same principles apply. You identify what each side wants. You find the intersection of those wants, and you create a solution that addresses both sets of needs." She sat down on an overturned crate and pulled out a small leather journal and pencil from her saddlebag. "Here's what I know," she said, beginning to write. "The settlers want access to fertile land, economic opportunity, and proof that development doesn't have to come at the cost of conflict. The tribe wants to protect their way of life, ensure they have a voice in what happens to their territory, and demonstrate that they're not obstacles to progress, they're architects of it. Eleanor looked up from her journal. If you can demonstrate that the settlers benefit economically and the tribe maintains autonomy and cultural integrity, you've solved the puzzle. But you need more than calculations. You need evidence that other territories have done this successfully. How would I gather that? Jacob asked. You'd research, Eleanor said simply. You'd find examples of cooperative development that actually worked. You'd document them. You'd create a case study that shows this isn't theoretical, it's feasible because it's been done. That could take months, Jacob said. It could take years, Eleanor replied. But you have 6 months to show my father that your vision is viable. That means you don't have time to be uncertain about what you need to prove. You need to be strategic about exactly what evidence you gather and how you present it. Over the next 2 weeks, Eleanor began spending significant time at the bunkhouse. She arrived most mornings with a fresh perspective on whatever Jacob had been working on the previous day. She brought him books from her father's personal library, texts on geography, agriculture, and economics that Jacob would never have. Found in Copper Ridge, she asked questions that forced him to examine assumptions he'd accepted without scrutiny. More importantly, she began to serve as a bridge between Jacob and the broader community, not through social acceptance, which she couldn't provide, but through access to information. Through her, Jacob learned about business dealings that were happening in town. He heard about disputes between settlers about water rights. He understood the economic pressures that different people in the community were facing. One afternoon, Eleanor arrived with news that changed everything. There's going to be a territorial council meeting, she said, settling into her usual spot at Jacob's work table. It's supposed to be confidential, but my father's friends talk freely around me. They assume I'm just his daughter, not capable of understanding business matters. What's the meeting about? Jacob asked. The federal government is threatening to intervene in the territorial disputes, Eleanor explained. If the settlers and the tribe can't demonstrate that they're capable of resolving conflicts cooperatively, federal authorities are going to come in and impose a solution. And believe me, the last thing anyone wants is the government making these decisions for us. Jacob realized immediately what this meant. There was a deadline. The federal government wouldn't wait indefinitely. And if he could demonstrate a viable plan for cooperative development before the federal intervention occurred, he might have the leverage he needed to make people listen. When is this meeting? He asked urgently. 2 months, Eleanor said. That's when the federal representative is coming to assess the situation. If a solution hasn't been presented by then, they'll start making decisions about how to settle the disputes. That's not enough time, Jacob said, feeling the weight of the accelerated timeline. It's more time than you think, Eleanor countered, because you have allies now. You have my father's resources, you have my help, and you have something else. You have a reason that people might actually listen. Fear of federal intervention can sometimes overcome provincial pride. Eleanor stood and walked to the window, looking out over the landscape toward the disputed territories in the distance. Here's what I think needs to happen, she continued. You need to meet with Chief Running Bear again, but this time you need to bring a proposal, not just questions. You need to show him that you've developed a concrete plan that addresses the tribe's concerns. And simultaneously, you need to prepare a presentation for the Territorial Council, something that shows them that cooperation is both economically viable and strategically necessary. The Territorial Council won't listen to me, Jacob said. I'm the outsider they've already rejected. No, Eleanor agreed, but they might listen to my father. And if the proposal comes from him, if a respected businessman in Copper Ridge stands up and says that this development is viable and worth pursuing, they'll have to at least consider it. Your father is already taking a risk with this arrangement, Jacob said. I can't ask him to put his reputation on the line publicly. He's already decided to do it, Eleanor said quietly. He told me that sometimes a man has to choose between safety and significance. He said you reminded him why he left the East Coast and came to the frontier in the first place, because he believed in the possibility of building something new. He wants to reclaim that belief. You're giving him that opportunity. Eleanor turned back to face Jacob, and in her expression he saw something he hadn't expected, genuine conviction. So here's what we're going to do, she said. For the next 2 months, we work every day. We refine your proposal. We gather evidence. We create a presentation so compelling that people will have to acknowledge it, even if they don't want to. My father will use his connections to arrange a private meeting with Chief Running Bear, and then we present this to the Territorial Council. And if they reject it anyway, Jacob asked. Then at least you'll have tried, Eleanor said, and my father will have aligned himself with someone who had the courage to do something difficult. That matters, Jacob, more than you understand right now. She gathered her materials and moved toward the door. I'll be back tomorrow morning at sunrise. Have your most recent calculations ready. We need to start building the economic model that proves this works financially. As Eleanor rode away, Jacob stood in the fading afternoon light, looking at the maps and sketches that suddenly felt more real than they had before. He was no longer working alone in the darkness, driven by a personal vision that few understood. He had a partner, he had resources, he had a deadline. Most importantly, he had someone who believed that what he was trying to do mattered. That belief, he was beginning to understand, might be the most important resource of all. The bunkhouse at the Broken Arrow had never been a place of intellectual work before. Cowboys came here to sleep, to mend their gear, and to escape the monotony of ranch life through cards and whiskey. But in the weeks that followed Eleanor's first appearance, it transformed into something entirely different. Maps covered every available surface. Books were stacked in neat piles beside Jacob's bunk. Sketches of irrigation systems competed for space, with economic projections and handwritten notes filled with calculations. The single oil lamp that illuminated the bunkhouse at night now burned almost constantly, creating a warm glow that could be seen from the main ranch house. Thomas Brennan noticed the change immediately. One evening, he rode out to the bunkhouse and stood in the doorway, surveying the transformation with an expression that blended approval and concern. "Eleanor's been working with you," he said. "It wasn't a question." "Every day," Jacob confirmed. "She's identified the gaps in my work. Without her strategic thinking, I'd still be gathering data without knowing what to do with it." Brennan stepped inside and picked up one of Eleanor's journals, flipping through pages filled with her meticulous handwriting and detailed economic projections. "She's in her element," Brennan said quietly. "I haven't seen her this engaged since she was a girl, reading every book she could find about westward expansion and territorial development. Her mother wanted her to focus on more traditionally feminine pursuits. I told her there was no point in educating a daughter and then expecting her to ignore everything she'd learned." He set the journal down carefully. "The problem is, the world doesn't make space for women like Eleanor. Intelligent, ambitious women who want to contribute to something meaningful. So she's been waiting, watching, storing up all this knowledge and strategy without an outlet for it. Now she has one. I'm grateful for her help," Jacob said. "But I'm also aware that her involvement is putting her at risk. The town is already talking." Brennan smiled without humor. "They've always talked about Eleanor. She refused to marry the banker's son because she said he had no thoughts in his head worth hearing. She started reading books on economics and agriculture when she was supposed to be learning needlework. She asked me why we couldn't discuss business over dinner instead of pretending women weren't interested in how the world actually worked. The town has already decided she's peculiar. Might as well give them a real reason." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "One thing, Jacob. Eleanor has never had anyone take her seriously before, not professionally. Her mother dismissed her ambitions. I encouraged them, but within limits I still expected her to marry well and settle into a respectable life. But you're actually asking for her input. You're genuinely incorporating her ideas. That matters to her more than you probably understand." After Brennan left, Jacob sat at his makeshift desk and thought about the weight of that responsibility. Eleanor had invested more than time in this project. She'd invested hope. She'd invested a part of herself that the world had told her couldn't or shouldn't exist. The work accelerated in a way that surprised even Jacob. Eleanor arrived each morning with a new focus, a new angle to explore. She wasn't just helping him refine his existing ideas, she was pushing him to think bigger, to consider possibilities he hadn't entertained. One morning, she arrived with a Spanish trader she'd met through her father's business connections. "This is Miguel Reyes," Eleanor introduced him. "He's been working the territories between here and Mexico for 15 years. I asked him about irrigation systems used in the desert regions of the Southwest." Miguel was a weathered man in his 50s with the kind of practical knowledge that only came from decades of working the land. He spent an entire day with Jacob, explaining techniques used in arid regions, showing him sketches of irrigation methods that had been developed and refined over centuries. "Water is everything out here," Miguel said in accented English. "You cannot force the land to do what it does not want to do, but you can work with it. You can understand its rhythms. The Spanish, we learned this from the Moors. The Indians, they knew it before anyone. The American settlers, they tried to conquer the land. That is why they always fail." Jacob recorded everything Miguel told him, asking detailed questions about implementation costs, labor requirements, and seasonal considerations. This was exactly the kind of practical information he'd been lacking, the bridge between theoretical knowledge and actual application. Eleanor watched the interaction with satisfaction. "Now you have it from someone who's the self, succeeded in similar territories," she said, after Miguel left. "Theory is important, but examples of success are what will convince people that this is possible." Another breakthrough came when Eleanor brought a ledger from her father's business records. "My father thinks you need to see what successful development looks like economically," she explained, opening the carefully maintained books. "He's willing to show you his business model, his costs, his revenues, his profit margins. Not to boast, but to give you a template for how to present financial projections in a way that convinces skeptical investors." Jacob studied the meticulous records, seeing how Thomas Brennan had built his wealth through careful management, strategic decisions, and long-term planning. It was entirely different from the quick profits that some of the rougher entrepreneurs in Copper Ridge pursued. Brennan played the long game. He wants to show you that patience and careful planning create more sustainable wealth than reckless expansion, Eleanor said, watching Jacob study her father's records. "That's the narrative we need to sell to the Territorial Council. Not that this will make someone rich overnight, but that it will create stable, long-term prosperity for everyone." As the weeks progressed, the work began to produce tangible results. Jacob created a comprehensive proposal that included a detailed map of the disputed territory, marked with zones for agricultural development, zones for tribal cultural preservation, and zones for shared resource management. An economic projection showing how the territory could generate revenue for settler investments while maintaining tribal autonomy and resource access. A management structure that would include both settler and tribal representatives in decision-making. A water management system that utilized both settler engineering knowledge and tribal understanding of environmental sustainability. But it was Eleanor who suggested the most crucial element. "We need to show what this looks like in practice," she said one afternoon. "Not as abstract plans, but as a visualization, something that helps people see what the territory could become." She commissioned an artist from a neighboring town to create a series of watercolor paintings based on Jacob's maps and descriptions. The paintings showed the territory transformed fields of crops flourishing beside preserved tribal lands, irrigation systems flowing with water, settlers and tribal members working together, a community that served both cultures. When the paintings arrived, even Jacob was struck by their power. Seeing his abstract vision rendered in color and form made it suddenly tangible and real. It was one thing to describe a concept. It was entirely different to see it. "This is what we present," Eleanor said, arranging the paintings in sequence. Words and numbers for the people who think that way, but images for the people who feel their way toward understanding. You need both. During this time, something else was happening that neither Jacob nor Eleanor explicitly acknowledged, but both felt deeply. The work was changing them. Jacob was no longer the isolated outsider, working alone in darkness. He had a partner who challenged his thinking, who pushed him to be more rigorous, who believed in his vision not because she had to, but because she saw its genuine merit. The constant ridicule from the town seemed to matter less when he had someone who took his work seriously. Eleanor, meanwhile, was experiencing something equally transformative. She was contributing to something meaningful. Her intelligence was being valued. Her strategic thinking was producing real results. For the first time in her life, her ambitions weren't being politely redirected or gently suppressed. They were being actively utilized. There was an intimacy that developed between them that went beyond romance, though neither of them could entirely ignore the porous physical attraction that simmered beneath the intellectual partnership. It was the intimacy of shared purpose, of working towards something larger than themselves, of being truly seen and valued by another person. One evening, as they were reviewing the proposal in the fading light, Eleanor said something that caught Jacob off guard. "When this is over, regardless of what happens with the Territorial Council, I want you to know that this matters. What we've built here matters. Not because it might succeed, but because you did something that most people wouldn't have the courage to attempt. You refused to accept the limitations that other people tried to place on you. You did the same thing," Jacob replied. "You could have conformed. You could have married someone suitable and lived a quiet life. Instead, you chose to do something that the world told you women shouldn't do." "But I had a choice," Eleanor said. "I was born into a family with resources and education. You had to fight for everything. That's different." "No," Jacob said quietly. "The external circumstances were different, but the internal requirement was the same. We both had to choose between the safety of conformity and the risk of authenticity. We both chose authenticity." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, then said, "The Territorial Council meeting with my father is scheduled for next week. We need to be prepared for their questions. We need to anticipate their objections." It was a pivot away from the moment of vulnerability, but Jacob understood. They weren't ready to examine what was happening between them. The work was too important. The deadline was too close. Over the next week, they prepared relentlessly. Eleanor coached Jacob on how to present the information, how to anticipate objections, how to frame answers in ways that would resonate with different members of the Territorial Council. Jacob refined the proposal one final time, ensuring every detail was precise and every projection was defensible. By the night before the presentation, the bunkhouse was filled with organized materials, maps, projections, paintings, ledgers, and handwritten notes. Everything was arranged in the exact order it would be presented. Thomas Brennan arrived late that evening, unexpected. He studied the materials in silence, then looked at Jacob and Eleanor with an expression of genuine respect. "This is good work," he said finally. "This is compelling. This is the kind of proposal that could actually change how people think about what's possible in this territory." "We'll know tomorrow," Eleanor said. "You'll know tomorrow," Brennan agreed. "But I want you both to understand something. Regardless of what the Territorial Council decides, I'm proud of what you've built here. I'm proud to be associated with it, and I'm going to fight for it with everything I have." He turned to leave, then added, "The world doesn't reward people for trying to bridge divides. It often punishes them. But people like you, people willing to risk ridicule and rejection to build something that serves a larger purpose, those are the people who actually matter in the long arc of history. Remember that, regardless of the outcome." After Brennan left, Jacob and Eleanor sat in the quiet of the bunkhouse, surrounded by the months of work they'd accomplished together. "Are you afraid?" Eleanor asked. "Terrified," Jacob admitted. "This represents everything I've been working toward. If it fails tomorrow, I don't know what I'll do." Then we don't fail, Eleanor said simply. We've prepared for every question. We've anticipated every objection. We've built a case that's logically sound and emotionally compelling. Tomorrow, we show the Territorial Council what becomes possible when people choose collaboration over conflict. Outside, the Copper Ridge wind swept across the plains, carrying with it the scent of changing seasons. Inside the bunkhouse, Jacob and Eleanor stood together in the lamplight, surrounded by the physical manifestation of everything they'd worked to create. The moment of truth was approaching, and whatever happened next would change everything. The morning of the presentation, Copper Ridge buzzed with an energy born of scandal and speculation. News had leaked about the Territorial Council meeting, not the details of what would be discussed, but rather the simple fact that Jacob Hartwell, the town's most controversial figure, was going to present something to the council. And that Eleanor Brennan, one of the town's most prominent unmarried women, had been conspicuously involved in the preparation. The rumor mill had worked overtime to fill in the blanks with increasingly salacious interpretations. At the Golden Nugget Saloon, 3 men sat in a corner booth, nursing whiskies and discussing the matter with the kind of certainty that only came from complete ignorance. "She's been spending every day out at the bunkhouse," one of them said. "A rancher named Douglas Fletcher, every single day, riding out there like she owns the place. Her father's lost his mind," another man added. "That's the only explanation. He's letting some drifter turn his daughter's head. And now she's involved in whatever scheme Hartwell's cooked up." "It's worse than that," the third man said, leaning closer and lowering his voice. "I heard from someone who works at the Broken Arrow that Hartwell and Eleanor have been alone together constantly. Maps and sketches everywhere, if you know what I mean." The implication hung in the air like smoke. In Copper Ridge, a woman's reputation was a fragile thing, and Eleanor Brennan's was being shredded by innuendo and speculation. At the bank, Mayor Clarence Dalton met with several business leaders to discuss what should be done about this situation. "It's an embarrassment," Dalton said, his face flushed with indignation. "Thomas Brennan is allowing his daughter to associate with that outsider. And now, Hartwell thinks he can waltz into a Territorial Council meeting and present some scheme that probably involves what? Exactly? Collaboration with the Indians? God knows what he's planning. Whatever it is, we need to stop it," Robert Ashford, the county commissioner, said firmly. "The very fact that Hartwell is involved means it's contrary to the interests of decent people." "But what if Brennan stands behind it?" another man asked carefully. "Brennan has significant influence. If he's committed to this proposal, we can't simply dismiss it out of hand. Brennan will come to his senses when he realizes what this is doing to his family's reputation," Dalton said with confidence. "No man wants his unmarried daughter spending time alone with a drifter. When he understands how this looks, he'll pull back." What none of these men understood was that Thomas Brennan understood exactly how it looked, and he'd decided it didn't matter. Eleanor was experiencing her own version of social pressure, though hers came in different forms. When she attended the general store with her mother, conversations would stop when she entered. Women who had previously been cordial now seemed distant. One particularly bold matron had actually asked her directly about the nature of her involvement with Jacob Hartwell. "It's not proper, Eleanor," her mother, Catherine Brennan, had said quietly after that encounter. "I understand your father's business instincts, but you're risking your future. No respectable man will want to marry you if there's any question about your virtue." "Then I suppose I won't marry," Eleanor had replied calmly. "If my virtue is questioned simply for working on a business proposal, then my virtue was never what mattered to these people anyway. They wanted obedience, not virtue." Her mother had looked at her with a mixture of admiration and despair. Eleanor was her father's daughter in every way that mattered, and Catherine had long ago accepted that her daughter would not live a conventional life. Jacob, meanwhile, was experiencing the pressure in more direct ways. Other ranch hands had begun to treat him with open hostility. The men at the feed store would turn away when he approached. One evening, someone left a note pinned to the bunkhouse door, "Traitor to his kind." Thomas Brennan addressed this directly with Jacob 2 days before the presentation. "They're going to do everything they can to make you doubt yourself," Brennan said. "They're going to attack Eleanor's reputation. They're going to question your motives. They're going to suggest that your proposal is some kind of conspiracy to benefit the tribe at the expense of the settlers. That's what frightened people do. They attack what they don't understand." "I'm concerned about Eleanor," Jacob said. "She shouldn't have to bear the brunt of their judgment because of my work." "Eleanor is not bearing the brunt of anything," Brennan replied firmly. "She's chosen her path. She understands the cost, and she's decided it's worth it. Don't dishonor that choice by suggesting she's a victim. She's not. She's a partner who's made a deliberate decision to stand with you." But despite Brennan's reassurance, the pressure intensified as the meeting date approached. 2 days before the presentation, Jacob was confronted directly. He was at the territorial office, reviewing maps with the clerk, when Sheriff Marcus Webb approached him with an expression that suggested he wasn't bringing good news. "Hartwell," the sheriff said, drawing Jacob outside, "I need to speak with you privately." Once they were alone, Webb said, "I've been hearing things, threats mostly. People talking about how they might respond if you present something to the Territorial Council that they perceive as contrary to settler interests." "Threats of what?" Jacob asked, though he suspected he already knew. "Violence," Webb said bluntly. "Not immediate violence, but there's a current of anger building. These are men who feel like the world is changing too fast, like their way of life is being threatened. They're looking for someone to blame. Right now, that's you." Jacob felt a chill run through him. He'd known there would be resistance, but direct threats changed things. "I'm not going to tell you not to present your proposal," Webb continued. "That's your choice. But I want you to understand what you're walking into. The Territorial Council meeting will be public. There will be people there who are actively hostile to you. And after the meeting, regardless of the outcome, there could be consequences." "What kind of consequences?" Jacob asked. "The kind that territory sometimes applies to people it decides don't belong," Webb said quietly. "I'll do what I can to maintain order, but I'm one man. And some of these other men, they're not going to listen to me if they decide you've betrayed them." That evening, Jacob told Eleanor about the conversation with the sheriff. He expected her to express concern or to suggest that they withdraw the proposal. Instead, she seemed to make a decision. "We need to visit Chief Running Bear," she said, "before the presentation." "Why?" Jacob asked. "Because the Territorial Council needs to see that the tribe is behind this proposal," Eleanor explained. "They need to know that the tribal leadership endorses this plan. If they see the tribe and the settlers coming together on this, it changes the narrative. It's not Jacob Hartwell imposing something on both sides. It's both leadership structures recommitting to cooperation." The next morning, Jacob and Eleanor rode to the tribal lands. It was Eleanor's first time visiting the reservation, and Jacob could see her taking in details the layout of the encampment, the structures, the people going about their daily lives. She observed like she did everything with careful attention and genuine interest. Chief Running Bear received them in his lodge. He was an impressive figure even in his advanced age, his presence commanding respect without requiring it to be stated explicitly. After Jacob explained the proposal and Eleanor summarized their work preparing for the Territorial Council presentation, the chief was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke. 3 years ago, I told you that if you mastered the understanding of this territory, the greatest opportunity awaited," Running Bear said, looking directly at Jacob. "What you have brought to me is not a proposal. It is a vision. It is evidence that a white man has listened, that he has learned, that he understands that progress does not require the destruction of what came before." He turned to Eleanor. "And you are the daughter of the merchant Brennan. You have chosen to work on something that brings your people and my people together. This is not a small thing in a world that teaches us to fear one another. I need your help," Jacob said. The Territorial Council will not believe in this proposal unless they see that your people endorse it. I will endorse it publicly, Running Bear said. I will come to this meeting. My council members will come. We will show that we see the value in what you have proposed. But I need you to understand something, Jacob Hartwell. This proposal, regardless of whether the council accepts it, represents something that cannot be undone. You have proven that cooperation is possible, that understanding across cultures is possible. Even if they reject this specific plan, that seed has been planted. That knowledge exists now. Other men, other leaders, will build on what you have started. As Jacob and Eleanor rode back toward Copper Ridge, Eleanor said quietly, "He's right, you know. Whatever happens tomorrow, we've already changed something. We've shown that it's possible." "That's little comfort if they vote to reject the proposal," Jacob said. "Then we live with that knowledge," Eleanor replied. "We know we tried. We know we did everything we could. And we know that what we've built, this partnership, this work, this vision matters regardless of their approval." The night before the presentation, Jacob sat alone in the bunkhouse, surrounded by all the materials they'd prepared, the maps, the projections, the paintings, the evidence carefully organized and ready for presentation. There was a knock at the door. Eleanor entered, carrying 2 cups of hot tea. "I couldn't sleep," she said, handing him one. "I thought you probably couldn't either." They sat in companionable silence for a while. Then Eleanor said, "My mother asked me today why I was willing to risk my reputation for something that might fail. She seemed to think it was reckless." "What did you tell her?" Jacob asked. "I told her that the only real failure would be not trying," Eleanor said. "That a life lived for the approval of people who don't understand you isn't really a life at all. That I'd rather be ridiculed for attempting something meaningful than respected for conforming to something empty." "You're remarkably wise for someone your age," Jacob said. Eleanor smiled. "I've had good teachers, people who showed me that convention is not the same as morality, that safety is not the same as significance, that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is believe in something before anyone else does." She stood to leave, then paused at the door. "Whatever happens tomorrow, Jacob, I want you to know that this has mattered to me. This work, this partnership, you. It's all mattered." After she left, Jacob was alone again with his thoughts. But this time, the isolation felt different. It was no longer the loneliness of rejection and misunderstanding. It was the quiet focus of someone preparing for something significant, something that, regardless of the outcome, would define who he was and what he stood for. The Territorial Council was meeting at noon. By that time, everything would be decided. The presentation would either open minds or close them permanently. The proposal would either find support or be dismissed with contempt. Jacob pulled out a piece of parchment and began writing, not for the presentation that was prepared and ready, but for himself. A reflection on everything that had led him to this moment. Everything that had transformed an isolated drifter into someone who believed that cooperation was possible, that understanding could bridge seemingly insurmountable differences. As dawn broke over the Copper Ridge Plains, Jacob put down his pen, set aside his fears, and prepared himself for the day that would either validate everything he'd worked for or prove it all to be a beautiful but futile dream. The moment of truth had arrived. The Territorial Council meeting was scheduled for noon in the town hall, a modest building that served as both courthouse and civic gathering space. Jacob arrived an hour early to set up the materials, his hands steady despite the nervous energy coursing through him. The paintings were arranged on easels, the maps were laid out on tables, the ledgers containing the economic projections were stacked in the exact order he would reference them. Eleanor arrived with her father, both of them dressed formally in a way that suggested they understood the significance of the moment. Thomas Brennan looked determined. Eleanor looked focused, the kind of focus that came from complete mental preparation. "Chief Running Bear is here," Eleanor said quietly, pulling Jacob aside. "He's waiting outside with 3 of his council members." They'll enter once the meeting begins, so we can establish the settler perspective first, before the tribal council demonstrates its support." Jacob nodded, appreciating the strategic sequencing. It was Eleanor's work. She discussed this with Chief Running Bear to ensure maximum impact. At 11:55 a.m., the townspeople began to arrive. Mayor Dalton entered with several business leaders. Sheriff Webb took a Blav Yuma position near the back, his presence both reassuring and a reminder of the potential for conflict. A significant portion of Copper Ridge's male population filed in, filling the benches with an undercurrent of tension and hostility. County Commissioner Robert Ashford called the meeting to order. "We've gathered today to hear a proposal regarding the disputed territories between our settlement and the tribal lands," Ashford announced. "Thomas Brennan has requested time to present an alternative approach to managing these disputed areas. Mr. Brennan, you have the floor." Thomas Brennan stood and moved to the front of the room with the bearing of a man who had conducted business in difficult circumstances his entire life. "I'm going to be brief," Brennan began, "because the proposal I'm about to present speaks for itself, if you're willing to listen. For years, we've approached the territorial disputes as a zero-sum conflict. We assumed that if the tribe gained something, we lost something. That cooperation was impossible because our interests were fundamentally opposed." He gestured toward Jacob. "This young man has spent the last several months investigating whether that assumption was actually true. What he's discovered is that it's not. The territories in question have enough resources to serve both communities if we manage them intelligently." Brennan spent the next 20 minutes presenting an overview of Jacob's proposal. He spoke with the authority of someone who understood business, who had reviewed the calculations, and who believed in the concept. He presented the economic projections, showing how cooperative development would create sustained wealth for both communities. Then he introduced Jacob. "Jacob Hartwell will now walk you through the specific details of how this would work," Brennan concluded, stepping aside. Jacob took his position at the front of the room. He was acutely aware of the hostile energy radiating from portions of the crowd, but he'd prepared for this. He'd anticipated their objections. He knew exactly what questions would be asked. He began with the map, showing the territorial division he'd proposed. He explained the agricultural zones, the water management system, the areas that would remain under tribal control for cultural and spiritual purposes. He showed the paintings that Eleanor had commissioned, watching as he presented them how some of the hostile expressions softened slightly. Visual representation could do what words sometimes couldn't. Then he presented the economic projections. He walked through the calculations methodically, showing where the numbers came from, what assumptions they were based on, and how conservative they actually were. "This isn't a scheme to benefit one side at the other's expense," Jacob explained, his voice steady and clear. "This is a plan that creates mutual benefit. The settlers get access to fertile land and economic opportunity. The tribe retains control over their cultural and spiritual lands, while gaining economic participation and demonstrated respect for their knowledge and autonomy." He was halfway through his presentation, building momentum and beginning to see some members of the council actually considering what he was presenting when it happened. A man stood up in the middle of the crowd. It was Douglas Fletcher, the rancher who'd been spreading rumors in the saloon. "This is horseshit," Fletcher said loudly, his voice slurred slightly with alcohol. "You're asking us to believe that this drifter has somehow discovered a solution that 50 years of territorial disputes couldn't resolve? That he's figured out how to cooperate with people who don't think like us?" The room erupted with murmurs and muttering. "He's been spending time with the Indians," Fletcher continued, gesturing wildly. "He's been influenced by them. He's lost his loyalty to his own people. And now he's trying to convince us that the only way forward is to abandon our principles and our land to satisfy people who want to keep us from developing what's rightfully ours." "That's not what the proposal suggests," Jacob said calmly. "If you'd let me finish, "I don't want you to finish," Fletcher interrupted. "I want you to leave. I want this whole thing to be recognized for what it is, a betrayal of everything we've built here." Other voices began to echo Fletcher's sentiment. The room was destabilizing, the careful momentum Jacob had been building, crumbling under the weight of fear and prejudice. Mayor Dalton seemed to be allowing this to happen, perhaps even encouraging it. He wasn't calling for order or attempting to restore civility. He was letting the mob mentality take hold. Then Eleanor stood up. "Mr. Fletcher," she said, her voice cutting through the noise with a clarity that commanded attention. "You said Mr. Hartwell has been influenced by people who don't think like us. I'd like to suggest that perhaps he's been influenced by people who think more carefully than we have, that he's learned something from them instead of assuming he already knew everything." Fletcher looked at her with contempt. "Miss Brennan, I'm sure your father didn't raise you to understand these matters. Perhaps you should sit down." "My father raised me to think," Eleanor replied, her voice hardening. "He taught me that progress comes from people willing to challenge assumptions. And right now, the only assumption this town is willing to challenge is whether Jacob Hartwell deserves to live among us." She stepped forward, moving to stand beside Jacob, facing the crowd directly. "I've spent the last 2 months working on this proposal," Eleanor continued. "I've reviewed the calculations. I've helped research the precedents. I've analyzed the economic implications. And I'm standing here to tell you that this proposal is sound, it's thoughtful, it's comprehensive, and it represents the kind of innovative thinking that could distinguish Copper Ridge as a territory that's capable of solving problems instead of just perpetuating them." "Eleanor," her mother said from the side of the room, her voice tight with distress, "please sit down. You're making things worse." Eleanor ignored her mother and continued addressing the crowd. "You can reject this proposal. You can choose to maintain the same territorial disputes that have defined this region for decades. You can continue to assume that cooperation with the tribe is impossible. But if you do, you'll be choosing stagnation. You'll be choosing a future that looks exactly like the past." She paused, letting her words sink in. "I understand that change is frightening. I understand that thinking differently about problems requires effort and intellectual flexibility. But I also know that the only thing standing between us and a more prosperous future is our own unwillingness to consider that our old assumptions might be wrong." The room had gone quiet. Eleanor's articulation of the issues had struck something in the crowd, not acceptance necessarily, but a moment of genuine consideration. That was when Chief Running Bear entered. He moved into the room with deliberate dignity, flanked by 3 tribal council members. He wore his traditional regalia, and his presence immediately transformed the energy in the space. This wasn't an abstract debate anymore. This was a face-to-face encounter between cultures. Running Bear approached the front of the room and stood beside Jacob and Eleanor. "I have heard your words," Running Bear said, his voice gravelly but commanding. "I have listened to your fears. You fear that we will take from you. You fear that cooperation means loss. These are the fears of men who do not yet understand that the land is vast enough for all of us if we manage it with wisdom instead of greed." He gestured toward Jacob's proposal. "This young man has listened to us. He has learned our ways of understanding the water, the soil, the seasons. He has respected our knowledge instead of dismissing it. We see in his proposal not a threat to our way of life, but a recognition of it." Running Bear turned to address the council directly. "My people will support this development. We will work alongside your people to make it real. But we will not do so as conquered people, accepting crumbs. We will do so as partners, with our voice heard and our interests protected. If you reject this proposal, you reject the possibility of peace. You choose to continue conflict. The choice is yours." The territorial council members looked at each other, uncertain. The political calculus had suddenly become more complex. This wasn't just a local controversy. This was a direct offer of cooperation from the tribal leadership. Mayor Dalton attempted to regain control of the narrative. "This is emotional manipulation," he said loudly. "The chief is trying to intimidate us into accepting terms we shouldn't accept." "No," Thomas Brennan said, standing again. "He's offering us a choice. And unlike you, Mayor, he's being honest about what the stakes actually are." Brennan turned to address the full council. "This proposal will be presented to the federal government in 2 weeks. They're coming to assess the territorial situation, and they want to see evidence of cooperation. If we present them with a unified proposal from both the settlers and the tribe, it demonstrates that we're capable of self-governance. If we present them with continued conflict, they'll impose a solution. I'd prefer to propose my own solution. I suspect you would too." The pragmatism of this argument resonated with several council members. This wasn't just about philosophy or principles. It was about power and autonomy. Commissioner Ashford called for a preliminary vote on whether to consider the proposal seriously, scheduling a full deliberation for the following week. The vote was closer than Jacob had hoped, but it passed. 7 in favor, 5 opposed, 4 abstaining. It wasn't a victory, but it wasn't a defeat either. The proposal would be discussed seriously. There would be a real hearing. The pathway remained open. As the meeting adjourned and people filed out, Jacob felt the exhaustion of sustained tension finally hitting him. Eleanor was surrounded by people offering congratulations. Her courageous stand had impressed more people than he would have expected. Chief Running Bear approached Jacob directly, away from the crowd. "You did well," the chief said. "But this is only the beginning. They will resist. They will doubt. But you have planted the seed now. They have seen that another way is possible. That is everything." As the sun began to set over Copper Ridge, Jacob stood outside the town hall with Eleanor and Thomas Brennan. The immediate crisis had passed, but the larger battle was far from over. "They'll try to discredit us," Eleanor said quietly. "They'll spread rumors. They'll apply pressure from every angle." "Let them," Brennan replied. "We've already shown them that we're not afraid. We've already demonstrated that we're serious. Now we have a week to prepare for the full presentation." Jacob looked out across the landscape toward the tribal territories, thinking of Chief Running Bear's words. The seed had been planted. Regardless of what happened next, something fundamental had shifted in how, at least some people in Copper Ridge, thought about the future. But the real test was still to come. The week between the preliminary vote and the full territorial council hearing was unlike anything Jacob had experienced before. The resistance that had been simmering beneath the surface of Copper Ridge erupted in ways both subtle and brutal. Businesses that had previously tolerated his presence now made it clear he wasn't welcome. When he entered the general store to purchase supplies, the proprietor simply turned away and refused to serve him. At the feed store, prices suddenly doubled for anyone purchasing. On behalf of the Broken Arrow, merchants began spreading word that they wouldn't trade with any business that supported Hartwell's scheme. But the economic pressure was just the beginning. Someone painted a message on the side of the bunkhouse: "Traitor." Another night, rocks were thrown through the windows. Sheriff Webb investigated both incidents, but found no witnesses willing to testify. The message was clear. The community would express its displeasure through intimidation and destruction of property. Thomas Brennan's business suffered immediate consequences. Customers began taking their patronage to his competitors. A bank that had previously been willing to extend him credit suddenly became difficult about his loan terms. The territorial council members who had abstained from the vote began privately expressing doubts about whether supporting the proposal was worth the social and economic cost. What surprised Jacob was how Eleanor responded to all of this. While most women in her position might have retreated, might have allowed social pressure to push them back into conventional behavior, Eleanor doubled down. She began attending business meetings with her father, explicitly showing her continued support for the proposal. She gave a public statement at the general store, speaking directly to the gathered townsfolk about the intellectual merit of the proposal and the moral bankruptcy of opposing progress through intimidation rather than argument. "You're making this worse for yourself," her mother said desperately one evening when Eleanor returned home with mud stains on her dress from having been deliberately shoved off a boardwalk by a group of women. "No," Eleanor replied calmly, cleaning the mud from her clothes. "I'm making something better possible. There's a difference between making things worse and making things uncomfortable. They're angry because I'm not conforming. That discomfort is necessary. But the real confrontation came from an unexpected direction. A delegation arrived at the Broken Arrow one afternoon, 5 men led by Mayor Clarence Dalton and Commissioner Robert Ashford. Thomas Brennan was working in the fields when they arrived, but he came immediately when informed of the visitors. They met in Brennan's study, and Jacob was asked to be present. It was, he understood, a test of Brennan's commitment to the proposal. "Thomas," Mayor Dalton began, his tone attempting cordiality, "we've come to discuss this matter with you directly. Between businessmen, between men who understand what it takes to maintain a functioning community." "I'm listening," Brennan replied, offering them no seats, keeping the conversation deliberately uncomfortable. "The proposal is causing serious division," Commissioner Ashford explained. "Good people in this town are beginning to question whether they belong here anymore. Families are choosing to relocate because they're uncomfortable with the direction we're heading. Businesses are suffering. The social fabric is deteriorating. Because you're causing division," Brennan said flatly. "You're spreading fear. You're using intimidation to try to silence legitimate discourse about the territory's future." "We're protecting what we've built," Dalton replied, his tone hardening. "We didn't spend decades establishing civilization in this frontier so that some transient could reshape it according to his whims." Jacob stepped forward. "With respect, Mayor, the proposal isn't my whim. It's based on months of research, consultation with both the tribal council and settler experts, and careful economic analysis. If you have specific objections to the proposal itself, I'm willing to address them. But opposition based on prejudice against me or Eleanor isn't a legitimate basis for policy." Ashford's face flushed with anger at being spoken to so directly by someone they considered beneath their social standing. "That's precisely the problem," Ashford said, his voice rising. "A drifter speaking to council commissioners as if he has equal standing. A woman who's abandoned decency and proper comportment participating in men's business. This isn't about the proposal, it's about the social order, and your presence threatens the fundamental order that holds this community together." Brennan's response was ice cold. "The social order you're describing is one built on fear and conformity. I'm not interested in maintaining that. Gentlemen, I think we're done here. You're making a mistake," Dalton said, standing. "If you continue to champion this proposal, we will ensure that Brennan Enterprises loses every contract it currently holds in this territory. We will organize a complete economic embargo. We will make it impossible for you to do business here. Then I'll do business elsewhere," Brennan replied. "And you'll explain to the federal representatives arriving in 10 days why you drove out one of your most productive citizens rather than adapt to the day possibility of progress." After the delegation left, Brennan sat heavily in his chair, the confrontation clearly weighing on him despite his outward composure. "Are you having second thoughts?" Jacob asked carefully. "No," Brennan said, "but I'm recognizing the real cost of this commitment. When I agreed to support you, I understood intellectually that there would be consequences. Experiencing them is different." That evening, Chief Running Bear arrived at the Broken Arrow, accompanied by 2 tribal council members. He came because he'd heard about Dalton's threat and wanted to ensure that Brennan understood the tribe's commitment to supporting him economically and politically. "If they embargo you," Running Bear said directly, "our people will trade with you. We have goods, we have labor, we have resources. We will not allow a man who has shown respect to be punished by those who fear respect." The offer brought tears to Brennan's eyes, not from weakness, but from the recognition that he wasn't fighting this battle alone, that by choosing to support Jacob's vision, he had become part of something larger than his individual business interests. The night before the full territorial council hearing, Jacob couldn't sleep. He walked out onto the plains, needing space and quiet to process everything that had happened over the past week. Eleanor found him there, sitting on a rocky outcropping and watching the stars. "I did this to you," Jacob said without preamble. "I brought this conflict into your life. Your family is suffering. You're being ostracized. You could have stayed neutral and none of this would have happened." "No," Eleanor said, sitting beside him. "You didn't do this to me. I chose this. There's a difference." "But the cost," Jacob began. "Is worth it," Eleanor interrupted. "Jacob, do you understand what you've given me? You've given me the opportunity to be useful, to contribute to something meaningful, to be taken seriously by someone I respect. You know how rare that is for a woman, how valuable." She turned to face him directly. "My mother has spent her entire life being decorative. She's told me repeatedly that being a woman means finding a suitable man and making a comfortable life within the boundaries he sets. But I don't want that life. I want a life where my thoughts matter, where my work produces real results, where I'm not constantly hidden behind social conventions." "Even if it costs you everything?" Jacob asked. "Even if marrying becomes impossible because of the choices you've made?" "Especially then," Eleanor said. "Because marriage to someone who needed me to be smaller, less intelligent, less ambitious, that would have cost me far more than any social ostracism ever could." She reached for his hand. "The only thing I've lost is the possibility of becoming someone I didn't want to be anyway." The full territorial council hearing took place the next day at noon. The town hall was packed with even more people than had attended the preliminary vote. Word had spread about the conflict. People wanted to see how this would resolve. Mayor Dalton opened the proceedings with a statement attempting to frame the opposition to the proposal as concern for the territory's stability rather than prejudice or fear. "The question before this council," Dalton said, "is whether we should fundamentally alter the territorial arrangement that has defined our region for decades, based on the untested theories of an outsider. This isn't about bias. It's about prudent governance." Thomas Brennan responded by presenting the economic analysis in even greater detail than Jacob had in the preliminary hearing. He brought in Miguel Reyes, the Spanish trader, who testified about the success of similar cooperative arrangements in territories further south. He presented letters from business leaders in other regions, endorsing the proposal's theoretical soundness. Then Jacob presented the full proposal again, this time anticipating and directly addressing every objection that had been raised over the past week. But the real turning point came when Eleanor presented a detailed study she'd conducted on territorial development that had failed due to the exact prejudices that Copper Ridge was clinging to. "I've researched what happened in 3 territories that rejected cooperation with indigenous peoples," Eleanor explained, presenting documents and historical records. In each case, continued conflict over resources created economic stagnation. In each case, the territories that eventually survived were those that learned to cooperate. In each case, the leadership that opposed cooperation was eventually replaced by leadership that recognized the necessity of change. She paused, letting her research sink in. "We have the opportunity to learn from history without having to repeat its failures, but only if we choose to." Chief Running Bear again came forward, this time not just to express support, but to present the tribe's own counter-proposal if the settlers remained unwilling to cooperate. "We can exist separately," Running Bear said, "but we will thrive together. If this council chooses separation, we will manage our territories according to our understanding. We will succeed. But we will succeed alone, and the settler territories will struggle. This is not threat. This is observation based on centuries of knowledge about this land." The vote was called at 3 in the afternoon. This time, the result was decisive. 9 in favor, 3 opposed, one abstaining. The proposal had passed. As the gavel came down, Jacob felt something fundamental shift inside him. Months of work, ridicule, isolation, and struggle had produced a tangible result. But more than that, it had produced a demonstration that change was possible. That prejudice could be overcome by evidence, by persistence, and by people willing to stand publicly for what they believed was right. Mayor Dalton immediately stood and walked out of the hearing without comment. Several other opponents followed him, but others, the business leaders who had abstained, approached Jacob and Eleanor afterward, asking questions about implementation, about how they might be involved in the actual development. That evening, as news of the council's decision spread through Copper Ridge, the tenor of the town began to shift subtly. The opposition didn't disappear, but it became less confident. They had lost the official political battle. They could continue to resist informally through social pressure and economic leverage, but they no longer had institutional backing. Thomas Brennan hosted a celebration at his home that night, a gathering of the people who had supported the proposal. It was modest compared to typical social events, because most of Copper Ridge society remained officially opposed. But it was genuine. As Jacob and Eleanor stood on the veranda looking out over the landscape, Eleanor said, "The hard part is still ahead, isn't it? Getting people to actually work together, to implement this proposal that will be even more difficult than convincing them to vote for it." "Yes," Jacob agreed, "but we've proven something important. We've proven that when presented with evidence and leadership willing to champion change, people can choose differently. That's not guaranteed to solve everything, but it's something." "It's everything," Eleanor corrected, "because everything else flows from that single moment when people realize that the world doesn't have to stay the way it's always been." The confrontation with prejudice wasn't over. It would continue in different forms, in resistance to implementation, in doubt about whether cooperation would actually work, in the ongoing tension between those who had accepted the proposal and those who resented it. But the turning point had arrived. The tide had shifted, and Jacob Hartwell, the drifter who had been ridiculed and rejected, had become the man who had changed how an entire territory thought about its future. The spring came to the Copper Ridge territory with the kind of gradual insistence that suggested the land itself was endorsing the new direction the community had chosen. Snow melted into rushing streams. Grass emerged through the slush. The rigid coldness that had characterized both the weather and the town's attitude began to soften, revealing possibilities that winter had hidden. 6 weeks after the territorial council vote, the first work crews assembled at the disputed territory's southern boundary. It was a strange sight, settlers and tribal members working alongside one another, not in the forced cooperation of occupied territory, but in the deliberate partnership that the proposal had outlined. Jacob stood on a ridge overlooking the worksite, watching as the initial infrastructure began to take shape. Water management systems were being constructed according to designs that blended settler engineering with tribal knowledge. Agricultural plots were being surveyed in areas that had been identified as optimal for crop production. Stakes marked the boundaries of zones that would remain under tribal jurisdiction. Thomas Brennan rode up beside him, his weathered face showing the satisfaction of a man whose gamble had paid off. "They're working together," Brennan observed. "I wasn't certain it would actually happen until I saw it with my own eyes." "It's tenuous," Jacob said. "One major conflict could still destabilize the entire arrangement. But yes, it's happening." Over the following weeks, the settlement's dynamic began to shift in subtle but significant ways. The business community, seeing that cooperation was producing economic activity rather than destroying it, began to soften their resistance. Contracts that had been quietly withdrawn began to be reinstated. Merchants who had participated in the boycott began returning to neutral commerce. More importantly, conversations started to change. At the general store, Jacob overheard 2 men discussing the development with genuine interest rather than hostility. One of them, A farmer named Harrison Wells was asking questions about irrigation techniques he'd observed tribal members implementing. "The water flows more efficiently than anything we've tried before," Wells was saying. "I'm thinking about implementing some of those methods on my own land. They're not dependent on the tribal knowledge. It's just better engineering applied differently." That single conversation represented something profound. Practical recognition that other ways of thinking produced better results. Not acceptance born from forced tolerance, but acceptance born from observable improvement. Eleanor had shifted her focus to a different problem. With the political battle won, she'd identified that the real challenge was ensuring sustainable cooperation at the community level. She began organizing what she called knowledge exchange sessions, gatherings where settlers and tribal members could learn from one another about practical skills and perspectives. "The council vote was important," she explained to Jacob one afternoon as they reviewed plans for the first session. "But it's just infrastructure. Real change happens when individuals change how they think about one another. When a settler sees a tribal member solve a problem in a way that's elegant and effective, it challenges their assumptions. That's where lasting cooperation begins." The first session was attended by 47 people, a mix of settlers and tribal members. Eleanor had organized presentations on topics ranging from water management to agricultural techniques to traditional medicine practices that had proven effective for conditions that settler doctors had struggled to treat. What struck Jacob most forcefully was watching the conversations that happened during the breaks. A settler rancher asking a tribal elder about animal husbandry practices. A settler woman learning herbal remedies from a tribal healer. A tribal young man asking a settler engineer about construction techniques for permanent structures. These weren't forced exchanges. They were genuine conversations between people, discovering that they had valuable things to teach one another. Chief Running Bear attended the session and afterward spoke privately with Jacob and Eleanor. "This is what I envisioned," Running Bear said, his aged eyes reflecting satisfaction. "Not just territory divided and managed, but people learning to see each other as sources of knowledge rather than sources of threat. This is the real victory." But even as cooperation deepened in some areas, resistance persisted in others. Mayor Dalton remained openly hostile to the entire arrangement. A group of settlers who considered themselves the true defenders of frontier values continued to voice opposition at community gatherings. The sheriff reported occasional incidents of vandalism at the work sites, though nothing large enough to destabilize the overall progress. One afternoon, a confrontation arose that tested the fragile cooperation more directly than anything that had come before. A dispute erupted over water rights in one of the shared management zones. A settler named Raymond Marcus wanted to expand his irrigation system into an area that had been designated for mixed use, available to both settlers and tribe. The expansion would have limited the tribe's access to water during the dry season. Both sides prepared for conflict. The settler community rallied around Marcus's claims that he had the right to maximize his productive use of the territory. The tribal council began discussing whether the agreement had been violated and what response would be appropriate. Jacob found himself in a position he hadn't anticipated, mediator between two communities that were beginning to trust one another, but not quite enough to overlook genuine disagreements. He met with Marcus first, reviewing the territorial agreement and the water projections that had been calculated when the zones were established. "The projections are clear," Jacob explained, showing Marcus the calculations. "Your expansion would reduce tribal water access below the minimum that was specified in the agreement. I understand your desire to expand production, but it violates the terms both communities agreed to." "Then the agreement is inadequate," Marcus replied defensively. "I should have the right to use my land as I see fit." "You do," Jacob agreed, "but not in violation of the terms you agreed to. However, there might be an alternative approach." Jacob spent the next day researching water conservation techniques and alternative expansion methods. He came back to Marcus with a proposal. The settler could achieve 90% of his desired expansion by implementing more efficient irrigation systems that would reduce water consumption per acre. The remaining 10% could be delayed until the dry season ended. It was a compromise that required Marcus to invest in better technology, but it allowed him to expand while respecting the agreement. Marcus was initially resistant, but when Thomas Brennan pointed out that investing in efficient irrigation would create long-term cost savings that would offset the technology expenses, Marcus reconsidered. The tribal council, when presented with the revised plan, accepted it as a demonstration of good faith and commitment to finding solutions that worked for both communities. What struck Jacob about this entire process was how different it felt from the adversarial dynamic that had characterized territorial disputes for decades. Instead of one side trying to dominate the other, both sides were looking for ways to accommodate their interests while respecting established agreements. It wasn't perfect. It required patience and flexibility from both sides, but it proved that the cooperation wasn't superficial. It was actually embedded in how the two communities approached problems. By late spring, the physical transformation of the territory was becoming visible. Irrigation channels cut across the landscape, carrying water from the Blackstone Creek into areas that had previously been too dry for agriculture. The first crops were being planted in the designated zones. Permanent structures were being constructed to serve both communities. A trading post where settlers and tribal members could exchange goods, a community building where knowledge exchanges and dispute resolution meetings could take place. More significantly, relationships were forming. Young settler men were learning construction techniques from tribal craftsmen. Tribal children were attending lessons in settler-run schools, and settler children were learning tribal languages and cultural practices from tribal educators. Families were beginning to intermarry, a development that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier, but now seemed like a natural expression of community integration. One evening, Eleanor brought news that surprised even Jacob. "I received a letter from the Territorial Council in Santa Fe," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of pride and amazement. "They want to study our arrangement. They're sending someone next month to observe how we've structured the cooperation and potentially implement similar models in their region." Jacob realized what this meant. Their local experiment was being recognized as potentially significant beyond Copper Ridge. The model they'd created wasn't just solving a local problem. It had broader implications for how frontier territories could approach territorial disputes. "We need to document this carefully," Eleanor said, already thinking strategically about implications. "We need to record what worked, what didn't, what we'd do differently. This could become something larger than any of us anticipated." That night, Jacob found himself walking the Contra territory at dusk, observing the changes that had occurred over the past months. The landscape looked different now, not because it had physically transformed, but because he was seeing it through a different lens. What had once felt like disputed territory marked by conflict now felt like shared space marked by possibility. He thought about Chief Running Bear's prophecy, "Should you master it, the greatest territory awaits." Jacob realized now that mastering it hadn't meant mastering the land itself. It had meant mastering the understanding of how people could work together, how cooperation could create abundance, where competition created scarcity, how differences could strengthen rather than weaken a community. Eleanor found him standing at the edge of the territory, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. "You're thinking too hard," she said, moving to stand beside him. "You have that expression you get when you're trying to solve an unsolvable equation." "I'm trying to understand how we got here," Jacob said. "How something that seemed impossible 6 months ago is now becoming routine. How people who were ready to reject me are now asking for my input on development strategies." "You showed them a different possibility," Eleanor said. "You showed them with evidence and persistence and refusal to accept their limiting assumptions. That's all change ever is, someone showing people that other ways of thinking are possible." "We showed them," Jacob corrected. "None of this happens without you, without your father. without Chief Running Bear and the tribal council. True, Eleanor agreed, but you were the one who started with nothing but a vision and the determination to make it real. Everything else flowed from that initial commitment to something you believed in despite everyone telling you it was impossible. As darkness fell over the territory, Jacob thought about the journey that had led to this moment, from isolation and ridicule to partnership and recognition, from a solitary vision to a collaborative reality, from a man standing alone against the world to a man standing with others to change how the world thought about itself. The greatest territory, he understood now, wasn't a place. It was a state of mind where people had learned to believe that cooperation was possible, that understanding could bridge difference, and that the future could be shaped by those willing to work toward it. The real work of implementation was just beginning. There would be challenges ahead. There would be people who continued to resist. There would be moments when the cooperation would be tested beyond what anyone believed it could bear. But the foundation had been established. The proof of concept was real. And for the first time since arriving in Copper Ridge, Jacob Hartwell felt genuinely at home, not because he belonged to the place, but because he had helped create something there that honored both the land and the people who inhabited it. The transformation wasn't complete, but it had begun, and that beginning was everything. 2 years after the Territorial Council vote, Copper Ridge had transformed in ways that would have seemed impossible to anyone observing the town during those early days of opposition and ridicule. The changes weren't just structural new buildings, improved infrastructure, expanded economic activity, though those were certainly visible. The deeper transformation was in how people thought about themselves, about their neighbors, and about what was possible in their territory. The cooperative development had exceeded even the most optimistic projections. Agricultural yields in the jointly managed zones were 30% higher than historical averages for settler-only management. Economic activity had increased by 50%, with the trading post serving as a hub for commerce that benefited both communities. Most remarkably, incidents of conflict between settlers and tribal members had dropped to nearly zero. Jacob Hartwell, the man who had arrived 3 years earlier as a drifter and outsider, had become something entirely different. A respected figure whose opinion was sought on matters ranging from territorial development to community disputes. But more importantly, he had become someone who had genuinely changed how two communities thought about one another. Chief Running Bear, now in his mid-70s, had begun to slow with age. But he remained active and engaged, often spending time at the shared community building where he would tell younger members of both communities about the history of the territory and the significance of the cooperation they had established. One afternoon, as Jacob worked on updated projections for the second phase of development, Chief Running Bear arrived at the small office that had been established to manage the cooperative initiative. "I wanted to speak with you before I cannot," Running Bear said, settling into a chair with the careful deliberation of someone whose body required more time and attention than it once had. "About what comes next? What do you mean?" "Wow," Jacob asked, setting aside his work. "I mean that I will not be here forever," Running Bear said directly, without the euphemism that settlers often used when discussing mortality. "When I am gone, there must be someone who carries forward the vision of cooperation, someone who both communities trust, someone who understands why this matters." Jacob understood what the chief was suggesting. "You want me to take a leadership role, but that's not my place. I'm not tribal. I'm not even truly part of Copper Ridge society." "Precisely," Running Bear said. "You are neutral. You are trusted by both because you have chosen neither side and both sides simultaneously. Your neutrality is your greatest strength." "Eleanor would be equally qualified," Jacob said. "More qualified in some ways. She understands the political and social dynamics better than I do." "Eleanor is brilliant," Running Bear agreed, "but she is still seen as insider to settler society, even though she has stepped outside convention." You are seen as belonging to both and neither. There is wisdom in that perspective. Running Bear stood to leave, then paused. Think about it. We will need to formalize the governance structure eventually. When we do, your participation will be crucial. After the chief left, Jacob spent the evening thinking about what leadership in this space would actually mean. He had never wanted to be a leader. He had wanted only to solve a problem, to prove that cooperation was possible, but solving the problem had created new realities that required ongoing attention and navigation. That same evening, Eleanor came by the office. She had been working at the Territorial Administration Building, now expanding her role to include official liaison work between the settlers and tribal council. My father is thinking about stepping back from active business involvement, Eleanor said as she settled into the chair across from Jacob. He wants to focus his attention on ensuring the cooperative framework remains stable. He's talking about establishing a formal position, something like a territorial development director. Who would take the position? Jacob asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. He's suggested you, Eleanor said. I think it's the right choice. You understand both the technical and social dimensions of what we're building. You have credibility with both communities. I don't feel qualified for that level of responsibility, Jacob admitted. That's probably why you should take it, Eleanor replied. Unqualified people rush in and make decisions with confidence. Qualified people understand the weight of what they're doing and take the responsibility seriously. Over the following weeks, conversations began about formalizing the governance structure for the cooperative development. There were detailed discussions about what authority various positions would have, how disputes would be resolved, and how to ensure that both communities remained equally invested in the cooperative's success. By fall of that year, a formal agreement had been established. Jacob Hartwell was appointed as the first Director of Territorial Cooperation, a position that would oversee the ongoing development and management of the jointly administered zones. Eleanor was appointed as Strategic Development Officer, responsible for identifying new opportunities for collaboration and resolving emerging conflicts. Thomas Brennan became the chair of a territorial commerce board that included representatives from both the settler business community and tribal economic leaders. Most significantly, Chief Running Bear was honored as the founder of the cooperative framework at a public ceremony that brought together the entire community, settlers and tribal members, standing together to acknowledge what had been built. The federal representative who had threatened intervention 6 months after the initial proposal had arrived to find not a territory in conflict, but a territory that had solved its own problems. His report to the Territorial Authority in Santa Fe became the basis for a new policy, encouraging other territories to pursue cooperative rather than adversarial approaches to indigenous land disputes. 2 years into his role as director, Jacob received word that the Santa Fe Territorial Authority wanted to establish a formal institute for studying cooperative development models. They wanted Jacob to serve as the director of research and to help train officials from other territories in how to facilitate cooperation. It was an opportunity that would have seemed fantastical to him 3 years earlier. But it also represented something he had come to understand. The solution to Copper Ridge's problems was only significant if it could be applied elsewhere, if it could help other communities avoid the conflicts that had nearly destroyed cooperation in this territory. He discussed it with Eleanor, knowing that accepting the position would mean significant changes to their lives. You have to do it, Eleanor said without hesitation. This work matters beyond Copper Ridge. If we can help other territories establish cooperation before conflict hardens into permanent divisions, we can prevent decades of suffering. But it would mean leaving, Jacob said, traveling to other territories, being away from here. Yes, Eleanor acknowledged, but not forever. You can establish the institute and still maintain your role here. You can train others to manage the day-to-day operations while you focus on the broader work. What about you? Jacob asked carefully. Would you come with me? Eleanor looked at him directly, and in that moment, Jacob understood that there was something that had been building between them for years, something beyond intellectual partnership, something that had been developing in the spaces between work and conversation, in the moments of shared struggle and shared triumph. "I would," Eleanor said, "but not in the way you might be imagining. I want to continue my own work. I want to establish educational exchanges between territories. I want to help other communities understand how cooperation changes not just economics, but culture and relationships. I want to do my own work, not support yours." "I know," Jacob said. "That's why I'm asking you to come with me." They married the following spring, in a ceremony that took place in the shared community building with both settlers and tribal members celebrating. It was unconventional. Eleanor had insisted on a wedding that incorporated elements of both traditions, with elements of settler Christian tradition alongside tribal spiritual practices that Chief Running Bear insisted were essential to blessing the union. The wedding itself became a symbol of how fully the two communities had begun to see themselves as integrated rather than separate. 5 years after Jacob had first arrived in Copper Ridge as a scorned outsider, the Territorial Institute was formally established in Santa Fe. It attracted officials, researchers, and thinkers from territories throughout the region who wanted to study and implement cooperative development models. Jacob and Eleanor divided their time between Santa Fe and Copper Ridge, working to translate the local success into scalable frameworks that could be adapted to different territorial contexts. But the most profound legacy wasn't in the institute or the official positions or the recognition that had come. It was in the relationships that had been transformed, in the young people of both communities who were growing up believing that cooperation was normal rather than exceptional, in the idea that had been planted, that the greatest territorial achievements came not from conquest, but from understanding. On a visit back to Copper Ridge, Jacob stood with Eleanor at the boundary marker that separated the shared development zone from the tribal lands. The landscape had been transformed, fields of crops, irrigation systems, structures serving both communities. But more than that, the boundary itself had been transformed. It was no longer a line of demarcation and conflict. It was a line of connection. "Do you think it will last?" Eleanor asked. "After we're not here to manage it anymore?" "Yes," Jacob said, "because it's not based on one person's vision anymore. It's based on the experiences of hundreds of people who have learned that cooperation produces better outcomes than conflict. It's based on children who have grown up knowing tribal people and settler people as neighbors and friends. It's based on economic reality. Both communities are better off cooperating than fighting." "That doesn't mean it won't face challenges," Eleanor said. "No," Jacob agreed. "There will be new conflicts. There'll be people who resist cooperation. There will be moments when the experiment seems fragile, but the fundamental shift has happened. People know now that another way is possible. That knowledge doesn't disappear." Chief Running Bear passed away the following winter, peacefully and at an advanced age. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people, settlers and tribal members, standing together to honor a man who had articulated a vision of cooperation and had lived long enough to see it become reality. At the funeral, Running Bear's grandson, a young man named Thomas Running Bear, named after Thomas Brennan as a symbol of the cross-cultural bonds that had formed, gave a eulogy that included a reflection on what his grandfather had meant to him. "My grandfather taught me that the land does not belong to any one people," Thomas said. "The land belongs to those who understand how to care for it, how to manage it wisely, how to use it in ways that don't destroy it. He taught me that we can do that alone, but we do it better together. That is his legacy. Not land divided between peoples, but land cared for by peoples working together." Thomas Running Bear, the young man, had been appointed as the new tribal representative on the Territorial Cooperation Board, a position that represented the continuity of the work across generations. Years later, when historians would look back on the territorial disputes that had characterized the frontier period, Copper Ridge would be cited as a turning point, a place where a different model had been proven viable, where an outsider had arrived with a vision of cooperation and had persisted in that vision despite ridicule and opposition, where a community had chosen, eventually, to believe that collaboration was possible. But perhaps the most significant legacy was quieter and less documented. The fact that a generation of young people had grown up believing cooperation was normal, that the next generation would not have to be convinced that their tribal neighbors were worth listening to or that settlers had knowledge worth learning. That difference didn't have to mean conflict. Jacob Hartwell, the drifter who had arrived in Copper Ridge as a man with no place, had helped create a place where difference was seen as valuable, where understanding was pursued actively, where the greatest territorial achievement wasn't the land conquered, but the communities unified. And in doing so, he had proven what Chief Running Bear had said years earlier, that when a man mastered the understanding of territory and the people who inhabited it, the greatest opportunity that awaited wasn't measured in acres or crops or economic productivity. It was measured in the relationships healed, the assumptions challenged, and the future made possible for those who would come after. That was the real territory. That was the true legacy. And that transformation, once started, could never be undone. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.